There are moments in Mafia history remembered for bloodshed, gunfire, and bodies on the pavement. And then there are moments remembered for something far more unsettling: silence. One quiet second, inside a closed room, where a decision failed and power shifted forever. This is one of those moments. In late 1920 New York, the underworld ran on fear. Bosses survived by striking first, killing fast, and proving brutality in public. Loyalty was enforced with violence, and betrayal was answered the same way. In that world, a man didn't need to be brilliant, he just needed to be ruthless. But Lucky Luciano was building something dangerous to that system. He wasn't trying to win the next war. He was trying to end wars altogether. Luciano believed crime could be organized like a business. Territories instead of vendettas, negotiation instead of chaos, profit instead of endless funerals. To the old bosses, that idea wasn't just disrespectful, it was existentially threatening. And when ideas become dangerous, bullets usually follow. One night, that bullet was supposed to come from the last person anyone would suspect: a man trusted to stand behind Luciano, to watch his back, to die for him if necessary. Everything was prepared. The distance was zero. The intent was clear. And yet, the gun didn't fire. What happened in the seconds after that failure mattered more than any successful assassination. No one screamed, no one ran, no blood was spilled, but every man in that room understood the same thing at once. The rules had changed. The old Mafia, built on instinct and violence, had just collided with something colder, quieter, and far more dangerous, a mind that was already 3 steps ahead. This is the story of the moment the trigger was pulled, and why the sound it didn't make reshaped the Mafia forever. New York, at the end of the 1920 wasn't governed by law, it was governed by momentum. Violence fed more violence, and power belonged to whoever struck hardest and fastest. The city's criminal underworld wasn't organized, it was fragmented, ruled by aging bosses who carried old country grudges into a new world gold rush. Prohibition had turned alcohol into currency, streets into supply lines, and murder into a management tool. Every dispute ended the same way: somebody died, and nothing actually changed. At the center of this chaos stood Joe Masseria, a man who embodied the old order perfectly. Masseria didn't need efficiency, he needed fear. His authority came from the number of gunmen willing to kill on command, and the number of judges, cops, and politicians willing to look the other way. Loyalty wasn't earned, it was enforced. Questioning him wasn't debated, it was punished. And for years, that system worked, because nobody imagined there was another way. But quietly, almost invisibly, someone was thinking differently. Lucky Luciano didn't see prohibition as a war to be won. He saw it as a market being mismanaged. Too many soldiers dying over territory that could be shared. Too many vendettas draining profit. Too much blood for too little return. Luciano believed violence was useful only when it served structure, and dangerous when it replaced thinking. That mindset alone made him a problem. In a world where power depended on fear, ideas were subversive. Luciano talked about coordination instead of conquest, about rules instead of revenge, about treating crime not as tradition, but as an enterprise. To men like Masseria, this wasn't innovation, it was rebellion. Not loud rebellion, but something worse: quiet confidence that didn't ask permission. What made Luciano truly dangerous wasn't that he challenged authority openly, it was that people listened. Young soldiers paid attention. Mid-level operators noticed that his crews made more money and lost fewer men. Violence around him seemed controlled, intentional. And once people start comparing outcomes, fear begins to lose its grip. Masseria understood this instinctively. You could kill a rival boss and inherit his enemies, but if you allowed a new way of thinking to spread, you risked losing control entirely. By the time Luciano's name was being spoken with respect instead of caution, Masseria knew one thing for certain: this wasn't a man you could intimidate forever. And in the old Mafia world, when intimidation stopped working, there was only one solution left. Power in the underworld rarely collapses from the top. It fractures from the inside. Bosses are insulated by layers of men willing to take bullets for them, but those same men carry lives outside the room, families, debts, illnesses, obligations that never show up in loyalty oaths. And the old bosses understood this better than anyone. If you couldn't reach the man at the center, you reached the man standing closest to him. By the late 1920s, Joe Masseria had exhausted every direct option. Threats failed. Intimidation backfired. Offers of partnership were declined without fear. Luciano wasn't reckless enough to expose himself, and he wasn't ambitious enough to make obvious mistakes. So, Masseria turned to a method as old as organized crime itself: buy the silence behind the target. A bodyguard lives in a contradiction. He is trusted absolutely, yet paid modestly. He stands closest to power, yet holds none of it. His value depends on loyalty, but his vulnerability comes from everything loyalty doesn't protect. Medical bills don't care who you work for, family emergencies don't wait for promotions, and desperation has a way of making even the most dependable men reconsider the rules. This is where the old Mafia felt most comfortable. Money solved problems that guns couldn't. Not through greed alone, but through relief, the promise that suffering could end immediately, quietly, with a single decision. One moment of betrayal could erase years of anxiety. And the closer a man stood to his boss, the cleaner that betrayal could be. What made this approach especially dangerous was its invisibility. No shootouts, no whispers in the street, no soldiers moving around neighborhoods. Just a private conversation, an offer made in a car or a back room, and a timeline set weeks in advance. If it worked, the result would look like bad luck. If it failed, there would be no evidence of who ordered it. From Masseria's perspective, it was perfect. Luciano would fall without a war, his crew would fracture without direction, and the message to anyone else with new ideas would be unmistakable: structure doesn't protect you when your own people turn. What Masseria didn't fully appreciate was the type of man he was dealing with. Luciano didn't believe loyalty was automatic. He believed it was conditional, and that every condition could be tested. Where the old bosses assumed trust and reacted to betrayal after it happened, Luciano planned for betrayal long before it ever surfaced. And somewhere between the offer being made and the trigger being prepared, Luciano already understood a simple truth. The danger wasn't the gun, it was the decision behind it. Most bosses waited for problems to announce themselves. Lucky Luciano listened for them long before that. He understood something the old generation never fully grasped. Violence creates noise, but information creates control. And in a city like New York, noise was everywhere. Information was not. Luciano didn't rely on grand conspiracies or a handful of trusted lieutenants. He built something quieter, a web of ordinary people who noticed everything because nobody noticed them. Parking attendants, waiters, doormen, cab drivers, shoeshine boys, men who stood in the same places every day, watching the same entrances, recognizing the same faces, and hearing the same names repeated without context. They weren't soldiers. They weren't criminals in the traditional sense. They were observers. And Luciano paid them not to act, but to remember. That system gave him a kind of vision his rivals didn't possess. While other bosses focused on who was shooting whom, Luciano focused on who was talking to whom, who met too quietly, who suddenly had money, who stopped asking for help. Those shifts mattered more than gunfire. Gunshots told you something had already gone wrong. Patterns told you something was about to. This is why Luciano was rarely surprised. He assumed every man had a breaking point, and that pressure was applied long before betrayal became visible. Loyalty, to him, wasn't sacred. It was conditional, and conditions could be monitored. When someone close to him became vulnerable, Luciano didn't panic. He paid attention. At the center of turning this awareness into action stood Meyer Lansky. Where Luciano identified the threat, Lansky translated it into logistics. Information alone wasn't enough. It had to be verified, timed, and used without revealing its source. Together, they treated intelligence like currency, something spent carefully, never wasted. What made this approach devastating was its patience. Luciano didn't confront rumors. He didn't accuse men without proof, and he certainly didn't react emotionally. When signs of pressure appeared around his inner circle, he didn't tighten control. He loosened it just enough to observe. People under stress reveal themselves when they believe no one is watching. The old bosses mistook this calm for arrogance. They believed Luciano trusted too easily, that he relied on relationships instead of fear. In reality, he trusted almost nothing except his ability to see patterns before they hardened into actions. By the time plans were being whispered elsewhere, Luciano already knew the outline. Not the details, not the timing, but the direction. And that was enough. Because when you know where a threat is moving, you don't need to stop it immediately. Sometimes, the smartest move is to let it continue. Not because you are careless, but because you intend to control the moment when it finally arrives. Most men in Luciano's position would have acted the moment suspicion turned into certainty. A quiet order, a disappearance, a body that never surfaced. That was the standard response. And it worked temporarily. But Lucky Luciano wasn't interested in temporary solutions. Killing a traitor solved a single problem. It didn't change behavior, it didn't educate witnesses, and it didn't send a message beyond fear. Luciano understood something colder. Betrayal is only powerful when it stays hidden. The moment it becomes visible, it loses its leverage. So instead of stopping what was coming, he allowed it to move forward slowly, deliberately under his control. This wasn't recklessness. It was containment. Every variable that mattered was isolated. The location was familiar, the timing predictable, the people present carefully chosen. Luciano placed himself where others would call it vulnerable, because vulnerability, when planned, becomes bait. He wanted the moment to unfold exactly as his enemies expected, right up until the instant it didn't. The brilliance of the plan wasn't mechanical, it was psychological. Luciano didn't want a failed assassination. He wanted a revealed decision. He wanted everyone in the room to see who chose money over loyalty when the moment arrived. Not through rumors, not through confessions, but through action, undeniable, irreversible action. When the moment finally came, there was no chaos, no scrambling, no shouting. The absence of violence was intentional. Silence forces attention. In that silence, every witness processed the same realization at the same time. This had been anticipated. Nothing about it was accidental. The calm response mattered more than any punishment could have. Luciano didn't rage. He didn't threaten. He didn't even need to explain much. His restraint reframed the entire event. The focus shifted away from the attempted act and onto the imbalance of power that made the attempt meaningless. A man willing to let danger reach point-blank range without flinching was not someone you rushed again. More importantly, the room understood something else. If Luciano could see betrayal coming from his closest circle and still control the outcome, then no one was operating outside his awareness. The message wasn't, "Don't betray me." It was far worse. "If you do, I'll know, and I'll decide when you learn that I knew." That night wasn't about mercy or cruelty. It was about hierarchy. Luciano demonstrated that he didn't just survive threats, he absorbed them, stripped them of power, and used them to redraw the map of authority in the room. From that point on, fear alone was no longer the dominant currency. Certainty was, and certainty, once established, is very difficult to challenge. The moment ended quietly, but its consequences moved fast. News didn't travel through headlines or police reports, it traveled through glances, pauses in conversation, and sudden changes in behavior. Men who once spoke freely lowered their voices. Meetings became shorter. Decisions that used to be challenged were accepted without debate. The underworld understood something had shifted, even if no one spoke about it directly. For the old guard, this was unfamiliar territory. Their power had always been loud. It relied on visible punishment and immediate retaliation. What had just happened offered no spectacle to respond to. There was no body to avenge, no obvious move to counter. The absence of violence left nothing to escalate, and that made it dangerous. You can respond to aggression. You can't respond to control. Within days, intermediaries began testing the waters. Conversations that once carried threats now carried proposals. Alliances were reconsidered. Lines that had been defended with guns were suddenly open to negotiation. It wasn't fear driving these changes, it was calculation. If Luciano could neutralize a threat without chaos, then working against him became inefficient. This was the beginning of a broader transformation. Power stopped flowing through impulsive displays of force and began concentrating around predictability. Men who valued profit over pride found themselves gravitating toward Luciano's orbit. Violence didn't disappear, but it became deliberate, used sparingly, strategically, and only when it served structure. The old system had depended on reaction. A move was made, and a response followed. Luciano introduced something new: preemption. He didn't wait for events to unfold. He shaped the conditions under which they could unfold at all. That difference changed how decisions were made across the city. Risk wasn't measured by courage anymore, but by visibility. The less attention you attracted, the safer you were, and Luciano controlled attention. This shift isolated men who couldn't adapt. Bosses who relied on intimidation found themselves surrounded by allies who quietly drifted away, not because they feared retribution, but because chaos was no longer profitable. Order was. And Luciano offered a version of order that didn't demand loyalty through blood, only compliance through logic. By the time rivals understood what had happened, the rules they depended on no longer applied. The underworld hadn't been conquered, it had been reorganized. Authority no longer announced itself with gunfire. It settled into rooms, into habits, into expectations that no one wanted to challenge. What emerged wasn't just a stronger position for Luciano. It was a new framework for power itself, one where control didn't need to be demonstrated repeatedly, because everyone already understood where it resided. History often remembers power by its noise: gunshots in the street, bodies in doorways, names whispered in fear. But the most important shifts rarely announce themselves that way. They arrive quietly, almost invisibly, and by the time anyone realizes what has changed, the old rules no longer work. What Lucky Luciano demonstrated that night wasn't mercy or cruelty. It was something far more unsettling: control without force. He proved that violence is a tool of last resort, and that true authority comes from shaping choices before they're made. The betrayal didn't fail because of bad luck. It failed because it was already obsolete the moment it was conceived. From that point forward, the underworld began to evolve. Decisions were no longer driven by emotion or pride, but by calculation. Loyalty stopped being enforced through fear and started being managed through structure. This wasn't the end of violence, but it was the end of violence as leadership. The men who survived were the ones who adapted, who understood that power now lived in predictability, not terror. That single, quiet moment marked the transition from old-world chaos to modern organization. It laid the groundwork for a system where disputes would be negotiated, territories divided, and wars prevented before they could start. A world where the man who understood people, not just guns, set the rules. And that's why this story still matters. Not because of who almost died, but because of how power was redefined in the space of a few silent seconds. Luciano didn't escape death that night. He outgrew it. In every system, criminal, political, or corporate, there comes a moment when raw force stops being enough. When the future belongs to those who see moves before they're made, who let others reveal themselves, and who understand that the most dangerous sound isn't a gunshot, it's the one that never comes.